The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is kind of like the last straw in events that will eventually lead to the American Civil War. And a lot of the Kansas-Nebraska Act had its origins with this guy, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was from Illinois, and his hometown was in Chicago, Illinois. It's actually where he moved. And Stephen Douglas invested in a lot of things, and one of those things was a railroad. And the big question of the day was, where would the Transcontinental Railroad, this railroad that linked the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, where would it go? Would it take a northern route and run through Douglas's Chicago, Illinois, or would it take a southern route from maybe St. Louis or Mississippi and travel west across this new territory that had been purchased by the United States? Where would it go? Well, Douglas wanted it to run in the north, but the big problem was this was territory that was organized for Native Americans. What Douglas decided to do was basically make void the treaties that had been originally intended for Native Americans, and he decided that he was going to introduce a bill that would organize this all into one big territory at first, and it would be called the Nebraska Territory. And what it basically said was that once enough settlers had traveled to this territory, it could become a state. But the big thing that made this different from all other areas, despite the fact that it's just a blatant violation of Native American rights, is that these states, once they had enough people, they could decide for themselves whether or not they would be slave states or free states. This goes back to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Henry Clay's original proposal that said slavery cannot exist north of states 36 degrees north and 30 degrees west. So if this passes, the Missouri Compromise would then be void. It would go away. And these states could become free states or slave states. And at the time, there's this huge idea that we have to keep the free states and the slave states equal. That way, one side doesn't do something that would upset the other. Think of it kind of like you're playing a basketball game, right? What happens when more kids come out to join your pickup basketball games, right? Like at first it's 3-on-3, and then someone comes and they join one team, like the team that's losing, so it's 4-on-3. But then another kid comes and we say, okay, it's 4-on-4, and then it's 5-on-5, 6-on-6. Once more and more kids come, you want to keep the teams equal. Well, that was the same thing with slave states and free states. Free states were worried that if there were more slave states, a law might be passed that allows slavery everywhere, and it was vice versa. So Stephen Douglas tells the South, hey, let's organize this into one territory. But eventually the southern states convince him to make it two territories, Nebraska and Kansas. They will organize that territory and decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. It would be divided, the territory, into two regions in the hope that at least one state would become a slave state. This bill was passed in 1854. It led to the Missouri Compromise being void. Now states could decide for themselves whether or not they wanted slavery. To many in the North, this was a blatant violation of the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, remember, what did Thomas Jefferson call slavery? He called it a wolf that you're holding by the ears, right? You don't like it, but you don't want to let it go. Many, though, in the North thought that they could just keep slavery away, hidden behind this magical line, and that slavery would exist in the South and it would never interfere with the North. But now, by a law passed by Congress, guarded by Alexander Stephens, I don't like that guy, when he passed that law, now states could decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. This leads to Bleeding Kansas, which is the next chapter in our studies.